They built them by the thousand, block after block, street after street across Brooklyn and Harlem and the Upper West Side, narrow attached houses, shoulder to shoulder, their faces cut from the same dark stone, their stoops climbing in wide steps above the sidewalk. Iron railings, carved doorways, windows framed in ornate brownstone that catches shadow like a face catching age, one house nearly identical to the next, and yet together they became something monumental, something deliberate, something that was trying very hard to say something. What they were trying to say was, "We have arrived." New York's brownstone row houses are among the most recognized pieces of urban architecture in the world. They line the streets of Brooklyn Heights and Park Slope, of Harlem and the Upper West Side, of Fort Greene and Cobble Hill. They appear in films and television shows, in photographs and paintings, on postcards sold to tourists who have never set foot in New York but somehow already know what the city is supposed to look like. The brownstone has become New York's face, its most legible, most beloved, most reproduced visual signature. But to understand what the brownstone really is, you have to go back to what it was. And what it was at the beginning was cheap. Before the brownstone era, New York's respectable row houses were faced in brick, or occasionally in white marble or pale limestone, materials that communicated cleanliness, permanence, classical dignity. The Federal and Greek Revival houses of the 1790s through the 1830s wore these lighter faces proudly. Brown sandstone, the soft, porous, warm-toned stone quarried primarily from the Connecticut River Valley, from Portland and Longmeadow, was used, if at all, only for stoops, windowsills, and trim details. It was functional, material, budget material. Not something you built a face out of. That began to change in the 1830s, and the change was not accidental. It was driven by a collision of economics, technology, and fashion that remade the entire visual character of New York. The economics were straightforward. Marble was expensive. Brownstone could be quarried in large quantities, shipped down the Connecticut River and along the coast to New York Harbor, and carved quickly and cheaply with the steam-powered tools that the Industrial Revolution had made available. A builder who wanted to give a house an ornate, impressive front, deep window surrounds, carved brackets, elaborate doorway pediments, could do it in brownstone for a fraction of the cost in marble. The stone was soft enough to work fast, and soft enough to hold fine detail beautifully. For a generation of speculative builders trying to sell respectable homes to a growing class of merchants, lawyers, and professionals, brownstone was a practical miracle. The fashion came from somewhere both grander and more romantic. In the 1840s and 1850s, the dominant architectural taste in America was the Italianate style, a loosely romantic vision of the Italian Renaissance, of Florentine palazzi and Venetian courtyards filtered through American ambition and applied to urban row houses on 20-foot lots. Tall, narrow windows with curved hoods, high stoops ascending in broad stone steps, deeply shadowed doorways with elaborate surrounds, bracketed cornices at the roofline. The Italianate brownstone was, in essence, a palazzo in miniature, a small mass-produced aristocracy for people who had no aristocratic lineage but very much wanted one. And here, crucially, the economics and the fashion reinforced each other. The dark, warm color of brownstone turned out to suit the Italianate aesthetic almost perfectly. The Romantic movement had turned against the cold whiteness of classical architecture. It preferred texture, shadow, warmth, and a certain sense of age and weight. Brownstone, with its deep earth tones and its ability to hold carved shadow lines, looked old in exactly the right way. It looked European. It looked serious. It looked, against all geological reality, expensive. By the 1840s, brownstone fronts had become fashionable. By the 1860s and 1870s, they had become the default. Builders laying out new blocks in Brooklyn, newly accessible by the expanding ferry and rail lines, covered whole streets in attached brownstone rows. One house nearly the same as the next, the variation in bay width and cornice detail just enough to maintain the fiction of individuality. On the Upper West Side of Manhattan, on the blocks of Harlem. Before the neighborhood's demographics shifted, the same pattern repeated. Rows and rows of dark stone fronts, their stoops marching up from the sidewalk, their parlor windows glowing in the evenings. These were not the mansions of Fifth Avenue. The families who bought Brownstones were not Vanderbilts or Astors. They were merchants and doctors, lawyers and accountants, small manufacturers and well-compensated clerks, the broad middle and upper middle strata of a city growing rich on trade and industry. They could not afford a freestanding villa. They could not command a full-block palazzo. What they could afford was a narrow attached house with a stone front that whispered, however quietly, of something grander than itself. The stoop was central to this whisper. By raising the main entrance a full story above the street, setting it at the parlor floor level behind a flight of wide stone steps, the Brownstone literally elevated its inhabitants above the city. You climbed to enter. You looked down at the street from the parlor windows. The basement, where the kitchen and the service rooms were, sat at or just below street level, accessed by a separate entrance below the stoop. The front door, ornate and framed, was for the family and their guests. The side or basement door was for everyone else. This division was not incidental, it was the whole point. What the Brownstone was selling, what its facade, its stoop, its carved doorway, its Italianate echoes were all collectively arguing, was a particular vision of urban respectability. Not aristocracy exactly, because these were not aristocrats, but something adjacent to it, something that said, this family is serious, this family is stable, this family has taste and standing and a claim on the good life that this city is beginning to make possible. Time equals, quote, 0.8 seconds, quote, / greater than the Brownstone was, in other words, a mass-produced dream. Built by anonymous speculative contractors, repeating standard plans, using a stone chosen largely for its cheapness, it offered the families who bought it a daily performance of dignity and arrival. And for several extraordinary decades, from roughly the 1840s through the 1890s, that performance worked. The stone held the light. The stoops rose above the sidewalk. The parlors glowed. The city had found its face. There is a particular kind of ambition that doesn't announce itself loudly. It does not build towers or plant flags. It builds a house on a respectable street, hangs curtains in the parlor window, and invites the right people for dinner on Thursday evening. It is the ambition of people who have worked hard, accumulated enough, and now want the world to recognize what they have become. Not with fanfare, but with the quiet, daily authority of a well-kept stone front and a high front stoop. This was the ambition that built Brownstone, New York. The men and women who bought these houses in the decades between the 1840s and the 1890s were not the city's grandest figures. They were not the Vanderbilts planning Newport cottages or the Astors commanding whole city blocks. They were the layer beneath, the merchants who had built comfortable importing businesses, the lawyers with growing practices, the doctors with full appointment books, the manufacturers of small but necessary things, the well-placed clerks who had saved carefully and married sensibly. They were, in the language of their era, respectable people, and respectability in mid-19th century New York was not simply a moral condition, it was a social address, it had a look, it had a stoop. To understand why these families chose Brownstones, and what the Brownstone meant to them emotionally, not just architecturally, you have to understand the particular anxieties of the American middle class in this period. This was a class without inherited certainty. Unlike the old merchant aristocracy of the early republic or the new industrial titans assembling fortunes of almost incomprehensible scale, the Brownstone buyers occupied a middle ground that felt, at every edge, precarious. Business could fail. Reputations could collapse. The city was growing so fast, filling so rapidly with newcomers from Ireland and Germany, and later from Southern and Eastern Europe, that the social order seemed to shift beneath your feet. To be respectable in New York in 1860 was not a fixed condition. It was something you had to maintain, perform, and signal, constantly and in every visible detail of how you lived. The Brownstone row house was engineered almost perfectly to perform this work. Consider the facade. The Italianate or Neo-Greek front with its carved stone details, its deep window surrounds, its elaborately framed doorway was a direct visual quotation from Renaissance Italy, from the palazzo tradition, from the architecture of power and cultivation that educated Americans associated with the highest reaches of Western civilization. To live behind such a facade was to align yourself, at least symbolically, with that tradition. You were not claiming to be a Florentine prince, but you were claiming something, that you were a person of taste, of culture, of material and moral seriousness. The stone front said all of this before you opened the door. The stoop said something more specific still. The high front stoop, that wide ceremonial flight of steps rising from the sidewalk to the parlor floor entrance, was one of the most socially loaded features of the Brownstone. It was borrowed partly from Dutch urban tradition, partly from the practical logic of elevating the main living floor above street noise and flooding. But its social meaning went far beyond the practical. To climb a stoop was to perform arrival. The guest ascending those broad stone steps, passing between iron railings, approaching the carved door, they were being framed by architecture, elevated above the street, presented to the house. And the family receiving them looked out from parlor windows set at eye level with someone standing on the top step, slightly above anyone still on the sidewalk below. The stoop made a distinction visible. It sorted the world, quietly and architecturally, into those who climbed to the front door and those who did not. Those who did not, the tradespeople, the delivery men, the domestic workers, used the basement entrance, accessed by a short stair descending below street level beneath the stoop. They moved through a different door, a different threshold, a different world. The same building, two entirely separate approaches. The architecture of respectability was also necessarily the architecture of hierarchy. Inside, the logic continued. The parlor floor, the main living level, accessed through the front door at the top of the stoop, was the family's public face. The front parlor was the room the street saw when the curtains were open and the room guests entered first. It was furnished with careful deliberation, heavy drapes, good carpets, marble mantelpieces, framed pictures, the best chairs. Everything in it was chosen to communicate stability, taste, and means. The rear parlor, separated by sliding doors, offered slightly more intimacy, but still a controlled, curated space for social performance. The parlor was, in the language of architectural historians, a theater of status. Every object in it was a prop. Every social call conducted in it was a performance. Being invited to someone's front parlor meant something. Being invited only to the rear parlor meant something slightly different. Being asked to wait in the hallway meant something else entirely. The Brownstone interior was a calibrated machine for the production and management of social meaning. What drove men and women to invest so heavily, financially, emotionally, socially, in this performance? The answer lies in the particular vulnerabilities of their position. Status anxiety is perhaps too simple a phrase for what these families carried. It was something more layered, a combination of genuine pride in what they had built, genuine fear of what they might lose, and a deep awareness that in a city without formal aristocracy, without legally defined class distinctions, the social order was perpetually up for renegotiation. The Brownstone was a hedge against that renegotiation. It was a claim staked in stone, and in the 19th century, stone felt permanent. There was also the question of legitimacy. Many brownstone buyers were second-generation Americans or immigrants themselves, or the children of men who had arrived in New York with little and built something through effort and calculation. The brownstone offered them a connection to an older, weightier tradition than their own families could provide. The Italian Renaissance references on the facade, the classical proportions of the interior, the whole architectural vocabulary of permanence and cultivation, these gave a merchant family from upstate New York or a lawyer whose father had come from County Cork a visual lineage they had not inherited but could purchase and inhabit. This was the transaction at the heart of the Brownstone era, not simply buying a house. Buying a place in the story the city was telling about itself. The speculative builders understood this transaction completely, and they designed for it with ruthless efficiency. Most brownstone rows were not commissioned by individual families hiring individual architects. They were built by developers who purchased whole blocks, hired skilled but largely anonymous master builders working from pattern books, and constructed rows of 10 or 20 houses at a time, varying the details just enough, a different cornice here, a wider bay there, to suggest individuality while maximizing profit. The result was a mass-produced aristocracy. The dignity was real, but it was also standardized. Your palazzo was identical to your neighbor's palazzo, and your neighbor's was identical to the one 2 doors down, so that the whole street was the same dream, repeated, and yet it worked. The families who moved in arranged their parlors, hung their curtains, trained their servants, and received their guests, and the performance was convincing. For several remarkable decades, an entire social class bought its legitimacy in sandstone, 4 to 6 inches thick, applied over common brick. The facade held, the stoop rose, the parlor received, and nobody looked too closely at the back stairs. There is a door you almost never see in the photographs. The photographs that made the brownstone famous, the ones that appear in real estate listings and travel magazines and the Instagram feeds of people who have just moved to Brooklyn, they show the stoop. Always the stoop. The wide stone steps ascending from the sidewalk, the iron railings, the carved doorway at the top, the parlor windows glowing warmly. Above the street. It is a beautiful image. It was designed to be a beautiful image. The entire architectural vocabulary of the brownstone front was assembled deliberately and carefully to produce exactly this effect. The impression of a dignified family rising above the city, elevated, composed, arrived. But beneath the stoop, set into the foundation at street level, there is another door, smaller, plainer, no carved surround, no ceremonial steps, no iron railings framing an ascent. Just a door at the bottom of a short descending stair opening into the basement. This was the service entrance. This was where the coal came in, where the tradesmen delivered, where the domestic workers arrived each morning before the family woke, and where they disappeared each evening after the family had gone to bed. The brownstone had 2 worlds. The photographs only ever show you one of them. To understand the hidden world of the brownstone, you have to understand the economics of domestic service in 19th century New York. At the height of the brownstone era, roughly the 1860s through the 1890s, domestic service was one of the largest categories of paid employment in the United States. In New York City specifically, historians estimate that as many as 16% of the population worked in some form of domestic service at peak periods. That is not a footnote, that is a workforce. That is a city within the city, invisible by design, laboring inside the walls of every respectable household on every respectable brownstone block. A well-appointed brownstone row house of the middle and upper middle class would typically employ somewhere between 2 and 6 live-in servants, depending on the family's means and ambitions. A modest household might have a cook and a general housemaid. A more prosperous one would add a nursemaid for the children, a parlor maid to receive guests and manage the front rooms, and perhaps a coachman if the family kept a carriage. The wealthiest brownstone households approached the staffing levels of minor English gentry, with a full hierarchy of indoor servants managed by a housekeeper or a butler. These workers were overwhelmingly immigrant. In the mid-19th century, Irish women dominated domestic service in New York, driven there by the catastrophic aftermath of the famine and the severe limits on other forms of employment available to them. German immigrants filled significant numbers of kitchen and service positions as well. By the later decades of the century and into the early 20th, African American women, many of them migrants from the South, navigating a labor market that excluded them from most industrial and clerical work, took on increasing proportions of domestic service work in New York households. Caribbean immigrants followed. The hidden workforce of the Brownstone was, in this sense, a direct index of the city's immigration history and its racial labor hierarchies. The Brownstone was not simply a house that happened to employ servants. It was a house architecturally organized around the concealment of their labor. The basement level, the floor beneath the stoop, accessible from the street through that plain service door, contained the kitchen, the laundry, the coal storage, the larder, and in many houses, the servants' sleeping quarters. This was the engine room of the household. The coal-burning range that heated the cooking and produced the hot water ran here. The heavy laundry work, washing, wringing, hanging, ironing, was done here. The preparation of every meal served in the dining room above was accomplished here in a space that was typically low-ceilinged, poorly lit, and in the winter months alternately freezing near the walls and suffocatingly hot near the range. From the basement, a separate stair, the service stair, tucked against the rear wall of the house, narrow and steep, connected the kitchen to the upper floors. Servants carrying coal scuttles to bedroom fireplaces, carrying breakfast trays to the family's rooms, carrying chamber pots down for emptying, carrying laundry up and down, all of this movement happened on the back stair, out of sight. The family's stair, wider and carpeted, rose through the center of the house. The two staircases rarely intersected. The two worlds they connected were designed never to visibly meet. This was not accidental. The architectural literature of the period was explicit about it. Household management guides and architectural pattern books of the 1850s through the 1880s discussed at length the importance of separating servant circulation from family circulation, of ensuring that the labor required to run the household was accomplished without disturbing the family's experience of ease and comfort. The ideal brownstone, from this perspective, was one in which everything simply appeared. Meals arrived at table, fires appeared in grates, rooms were cleaned and reset, hot water materialized in pitchers, all without any visible evidence of the work that produced these effects. Invisibility was not incidental to the service system. Invisibility was the service system's highest achievement. The daily reality for the people who lived and worked in that basement world was shaped by hours and conditions that the family upstairs rarely had to contemplate. A cook in a brownstone household rose before 6 a.m. to restart the range, which had been banked overnight but needed stoking and building back up before it could produce the breakfast that the family expected at 8. The range itself burned coal, heavy, dirty, requiring constant management. The kitchen was her domain and her prison. She might spend 14 or 15 hours a day in it, rarely leaving the basement level except on her half-day off if she had one. Housemaids worked similar hours. Their day began with the lighting of fires in the family's rooms before the family rose, continued through the cleaning of grates and the laying of new fires, the dusting and sweeping of parlors and dining rooms, the making of beds, the emptying and cleaning of chamber pots, the answering of the front door, the carrying of messages and trays, and ended, after the dinner dishes were washed and put away, somewhere in the late evening. Wages for this work were roughly $4 to $8 a week, with room and board included. Compensation that, while it covered basic shelter and food, left little room for savings, independence, or any life outside the household's walls. Sleep, when it came, happened in the basement or in an attic room at the top of the house, a small, often unheated space, the last square footage to be furnished and the first to be surrendered when the family needed extra storage. The bell system that connected the family's rooms to the service areas below is one of the most telling technological details of the brownstone interior. A series of mechanical pull bells, small brass fixtures set into the wall of each principal room, connected by wires running through the walls to a row of labeled bells in the kitchen or servants' hall, allowed the family to summon workers from anywhere in the house without raising their voices, without descending stairs, without any direct contact at all. The bell system made the relationship between the family and the people who served them almost entirely asymmetric. The family communicated desire, the servants communicated compliance. The architecture enforced the asymmetry. The bells rang downward into the world below stairs, and the responses came upward invisibly through the back stair, manifesting as meals and clean rooms and answered doors. There is a particular kind of beauty that depends entirely on not asking how it was made. The brownstone parlor, warm, composed, furnished with care, firelight moving across good carpets and polished wood, was genuinely beautiful. The families who sat in those parlors were not, for the most part, consciously cruel people. They were people who had grown up in a world where this arrangement was simply how things were done, where the labor below stairs was as unremarkable and as invisible as the labor that had mined the coal or quarried the stone. But the beauty was purchased. Every warm room had a cold one beneath it. Every composed parlor performance had a 14-hour workday behind it. Every stoop that rose so elegantly from the sidewalk had a service door hidden at its base. The photographs never show you that door. They were not supposed to. On a Thursday evening in the winter of 1875, somewhere on a tree-lined block in Brooklyn Heights or on one of the newly developed streets of the Upper West Side, a brownstone parlor is being prepared for company. The housemaid has spent the afternoon dusting the mantelpiece and straightening the framed pictures on the walls. The parlor carpet has been swept. The fire has been built up to a steady, generous heat. The gas lamps have been lit and adjusted to a warm, flattering level, bright enough to show the room favorably, soft enough to smooth out anything unflattering. On the marble mantelpiece, the clock ticks. On the side table, a silver card tray sits empty waiting. In the kitchen below, the cook is managing the final hour of a dinner that has been in preparation since morning. Upstairs, the family is dressing. This is not merely a social gathering. This is, in the precise language of the period, a performance. And the brownstone, its parlors, its dining room, its carefully maintained facade visible from the street, is the theater in which that performance will take place tonight, as it does every week, as it has done for the decades since this family bought the house and arranged it, object by deliberate object, into a stage set for the life they intend to be seen to be living. The social world of the Brownstone era operated on rituals so formalized they had their own grammar, their own vocabulary, their own strict rules of sequence and propriety. At the center of this world was the practice of calling, the leaving and receiving of formal visits, governed by an elaborate etiquette that consumed significant portions of the middle and upper middle class week. The mechanics were precise. A visitor arrived at the front door, climbing the stoop, presenting themselves at the carved entrance, and handed a calling card to whoever answered. If the lady of the house was receiving, the visitor was shown in. If she was not, the card was left on the silver tray in the hall, and the visit was recorded. Cards were returned, visits were reciprocated, invitations followed from sufficient reciprocation. The whole system was a social ledger, tracking relationships, obligations, and standings in real time. Who received you in the front parlor, and who kept you waiting in the hall, and whose card was returned and whose was not. These were not trivial distinctions. They were the mechanisms by which the Brownstone social world sorted itself, constantly and mercilessly, into the acceptable and the unacceptable, the included and the excluded, the arrived and the not quite. Beyond the weekly calling rituals, the Brownstone household hosted a calendar of more elaborate social events that mark the rhythms of the respectable year. Dinner parties, formal, multi-course affairs served in the dining room on the parlor floor with the best china and the silver that lived otherwise in the sideboard, were the primary instrument of serious social networking. An invitation to dinner in a good brownstone on a good block was a meaningful social event. It meant you had been assessed and found acceptable. It meant you were being introduced deliberately to the other people at the table. It meant that the host family was willing to spend real money on the hisi, food, on the wine, on the labor of extra hired help in the kitchen to include you in their circle. The guest list for these dinners was constructed with care that bordered on engineering. You invited people who would enhance each other's standing. You seated them in an order that reflected and reinforced the social hierarchy. You did not mix incompatible social registers at the same table, not because anyone said so explicitly, but because everyone understood. The dinner table of a prosperous brownstone household was a machine for the production and consolidation of social networks, operated by a hostess who was, in practice, a skilled social strategist working without a formal title or a salary. The question of who was invited and who was categorically not goes to the heart of what the Brownstone social world was actually doing beneath its surface of warmth and hospitality. The Brownstone neighborhoods of mid to late 19th century New York were not formally segregated by law, but they were profoundly segregated by practice, convention, and the quiet, persistent pressure of social exclusion. The families who bought brownstones and built their social worlds within them were overwhelmingly Anglo-American Protestant in the early decades, with German Jewish families gaining entry to certain neighborhoods and social circles as the century progressed, but often finding themselves restricted to their own parallel social networks, excluded from the innermost circles of the Protestant establishment regardless of their wealth or cultivation. Irish Catholic families, even as they accumulated sufficient means to afford brownstone addresses, often found themselves frozen out of the social world their neighbors conducted in nearly identical parlors on the same block. The exclusion was rarely announced. It operated through the unreturned card, the invitation not extended, the social call not reciprocated. It was enforced, in other words, through the very rituals of courtesy that define the brownstone social world, the forms of inclusion weaponized as instruments of exclusion. For African American New Yorkers, the barriers were still more absolute. Even those with professional standing and real economic achievement found the brownstone neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Manhattan effectively closed to them through a combination of real estate practices, social convention, and the unspoken but ironclad consensus of the white middle-class communities that define these streets. The few who managed to establish themselves in brownstone blocks did so against sustained resistance that rarely made it into the social columns but was no less real for its silence. The same building that performed hospitality for some performed exclusion for others, and the architecture made no distinction between the two. The Stoop, that great public stage of brownstone life, performed a social function that was both more intimate and more ruthless than the parlor. On summer evenings, families sat on their stoops after dinner, the adults on the upper steps, the children on the lower, the whole block conducting a loose, continuous, semi-public social gathering that was simultaneously casual and intensely observed. Who sat on whose stoop? Who stopped to talk? Who walked past without acknowledgement? Who had guests and what kind of guests? Who kept their stoop swept and their railings painted, and whose front had begun to look slightly neglected? The stoop was the Brownstone's most democratic feature, open to the street, visible to everyone, and simultaneously its most effective social surveillance instrument. The block watched, collectively and without interrupting the conversation, and the block knew everything. Reputations were built and damaged at Stoop level, in the small daily theater of who you were seen with and how you carried yourself, and whether your house presented itself, day after day, in a manner consistent with the standards the neighborhood had set for itself. This surveillance was not experienced as oppressive by those who belonged. It was experienced as community. The people who sat on those stoops on summer evenings, watching and being watched, were not conscious of enforcing anything. They were simply living their lives in the manner their world had arranged for them, which is, of course, precisely how the most effective social systems always operate. There was one more dimension to the brownstone as social instrument, and it is perhaps the most consequential, its function as a political and professional networking machine. The dinner tables of a well-connected brownstone households were where careers were made, contracts were awarded, partnerships were formed, and political allegiances were consolidated. The men who sat at those tables were merchants and lawyers, and minor politicians and bank officers, and their conversations over the fish course and the roast were not merely pleasant. They were transactional in the way that all elite social gatherings are transactional. The pleasure real, the calculation constant, the two so thoroughly intertwined that neither party would have thought to separate them. The women who organized and managed these evenings, who constructed the guest lists, managed the seating, choreographed the conversation, ensured that the right people were placed next to each other and that the food and wine reflected well on the household, were performing professional-grade social labor for which they received no professional recognition and no formal compensation. Time equals, quote, 0.3 seconds, quote, / greater than the hostess of a successful brownstone dinner party was, functionally, a political operative and a business strategist. She was called a wife. By the 1880s and into the 1890s, the social world the brownstone had been built to house was already beginning to strain at its own foundations. The wealthiest families were departing for grander addresses, the new luxury apartment buildings rising uptown, or the full-scale mansions of the Upper Fifth Avenue set. Changing immigration patterns were shifting the demographics of brownstone neighborhoods faster than the existing social order could absorb. The domestic service system that made the whole performance possible was showing its first signs of stress, as immigrant workers found factory work and other alternatives that paid better and demanded less of their dignity. The parlors still glowed. The stoops still rose. The silver card trays still waited in the halls, but the world that had invented this theater was already beginning to walk off stage. There is a photograph that survives from somewhere in Brooklyn, taken sometime in the early 1950s, that tells the whole story without a single word of caption. A brownstone block. The stoops are still there, still rising from the sidewalk in their familiar ceremonial arc. The iron railings are still in place, though some are rusting, some are bent. The facades are still recognizably Italianate. The carved doorways, the bracketed cornices, the long windows that once framed parlor life so elegantly. But the glass in several windows is cracked or missing. One doorway has been covered with plywood. The stonework on 2 or 3 facades has begun to spall and blacken, the soft brownstone surface flaking away in patches like tired skin. A hand-lettered sign in one ground-floor window reads, "Rooms by week." This is what the long fall looked like. Not a sudden collapse, not a single dramatic event. A slow, decades-long process of abandonment, disinvestment, subdivision, and decay that turned the most celebrated domestic architecture in America into a symbol of urban failure. And that came for the brownstone not because the buildings had gotten worse, but because the world around them had changed in ways the buildings could not follow. The first tremors came in the 1890s from an unexpected direction: fashion. Taste, which had elevated brownstone to dominance in the 1840s, began to turn against it with the same casual cruelty it had once turned against white marble. By the 1880s and into the 1890s, architectural critics and social arbiters were beginning to say, quietly at first, then with increasing confidence, that brownstone was heavy, dark, monotonous. The long, repetitive rows that had seemed so dignified and so European in 1865 were starting to seem oppressive. Edith Wharton, who knew this world from the inside, would describe the brownstone-era interiors of her New York childhood as places of suffocating conformity. The heavy drapes, the dark carpets, the sealed parlors, the whole atmosphere of respectable gloom. The high front stoop came in for particular criticism. It was inefficient, architects began to argue. It wasted the parlor floor's relationship to the street. It forced an unnecessary vertical journey on everyone who entered the house. By the 1890s, fashionable new row houses were being built with English basement plans, the main entrance relocated to street level or just below, the stoop eliminated entirely, and on many existing brownstones, owners began the process of cutting down or removing their stoops, trying to modernize a facade that suddenly looked dated. Time equals, quote, 0.3 seconds, quote, / greater than. The feature that had most powerfully embodied the building's social ambitions, its literal elevation above the street, its ceremonial approach, its architecture of arrival, was sawed off, block by block, as the class that had valued it moved on to other addresses and other aspirations. The deeper blow came not from architecture critics but from economics. The domestic service system that the brownstone had been designed around began to collapse. Immigration restriction laws of the 1920s reduced the supply of cheap immigrant labor on which New York households had depended for decades. The expanding industrial economy offered immigrant and working-class women alternatives that the previous generation had not had: factory work, department store work, clerical positions, jobs that paid comparable wages without the live-in conditions, the constant surveillance, the profound social subordination of domestic service. Time equals, quote, 0.3 seconds, quote / greater than. Families who had maintained 3 or 4 servants found themselves down to 1. Families who had maintained 1 found themselves managing alone. And a brownstone designed around the assumption of live-in domestic labor, with its basement kitchen located a full floor below the dining room, its back stairs designed for servants to navigate invisibly, its parlor floor separated from its service floor by the entire logic of the house, was extraordinarily difficult to operate without that labor. The building that had been a marvel of domestic efficiency for a household with servants was an exhausting inconvenience for a household without them. The wealthy and upper-middle-class families who could afford alternatives began leaving. The new luxury apartment buildings rising on Riverside Drive and Central Park West offered modern kitchens on the same floor as the dining room, central heating that did not require coal management, elevators, doormen, and the possibility of a civilized domestic life without a staff of 4. The brownstone, with its coal boiler, its steep service stairs, its dark basement kitchen, began to seem not merely unfashionable but genuinely impractical. Into the brownstones vacated by departing middle-class families came subdivision. Landlords who found themselves unable to attract single-family tenants discovered that they could make the numbers work by cutting the house into pieces. A 4-story brownstone that had housed 1 family and their servants became a rooming house of 6 or 8 single rooms, each rented separately. The grand front parlor became a bed-sitting room. The formal dining room became a kitchen for the second-floor tenant. The servants' basement became the cheapest unit of all. The houses that had been engineered for the performance of respectable family life became the stage for something quite different: the dense, improvised, economically pressured life of urban working-class tenancy. The 1940s and 1950s brought forces more powerful still. Deindustrialization was gutting the economic base of the neighborhoods closest to Brooklyn's working waterfront. The highways Robert Moses was cutting through the city's fabric were destroying adjacent residential areas, displacing communities, and accelerating the flight of anyone with the means to leave. And redlining, the systematic practice by which federal mortgage agencies and private lenders marked entire neighborhoods as too risky for mortgage lending, almost always those with significant Black and immigrant populations, was cutting off the flow of investment capital that might have funded repairs and maintenance. When a neighborhood was redlined, homeowners within it could not obtain mortgages to buy and could not obtain loans to repair, property values stagnated or fell, landlords deferred maintenance, roofs leaked, boilers failed and were not replaced. The beautiful carved brownstone details, the brackets, the window surrounds, the elaborate door frames, crumbled and were not restored, because restoring them required money that the system had decided this neighborhood did not deserve. Entire blocks that had been respectable middle-class addresses in 1900 were labeled slums by 1955. The label was then used to justify further disinvestment, further neglect, further deterioration. Qiao. A self-fulfilling prophecy written in the language of credit ratings and insurance maps, playing out in the bodies of the buildings and the lives of the people who still lived in them. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the city itself had become an active agent in the Brownstones' decline. Buildings seized for unpaid back taxes were warehoused by the city, minimally maintained or not maintained at all, their tenants in limbo. Some were demolished to make way for urban renewal projects and public housing. Others became welfare hotels, their rooms rented by the city to house families with nowhere else to go. The brownstone block that had spent the 1870s performing respectability was spending the 1960s being studied by urban planners as a problem to be solved. The stoops were still there. The carved doorways were still recognizable beneath the grime. The facades still held their Italianate bones. But the dream that had built them had long since packed its silver card tray and departed. What remained was the stone. Patient, deteriorating, waiting. Sometime in the early 1960s, a young couple, educated, probably artistic, almost certainly white, stood on a cracked sidewalk in Brooklyn and looked up at a brownstone that nobody wanted. The stoop was intact but dirty. The facade was stained with decades of soot and neglect. The carved doorway still held its original detail beneath the grime. Inside, the house had been subdivided into rooming house units, the original floor plan chopped and rerouted, the parlor floors hidden under layers of linoleum and cheap paint. The boiler was unreliable. The plumbing was improvised. The neighborhood around it was one that their friends and family would have described, in the language of the era, as rough. They bought it anyway, for almost nothing, by any later standard. And they began, room by room, to take it apart and put it back together. This scene repeated itself with variations across Brooklyn and parts of Manhattan throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Young professionals, artists, academics, and writers, drawn by low prices, large rooms, and what they described as authenticity, began moving into brownstone neighborhoods that the previous generation had been leaving for decades. They stripped the linoleum off the original floors. They uncovered the marble mantelpieces that previous tenants had boxed in. They repointed the facades, rebuilt the stoops that earlier owners had removed, restored the carved details that had been painted over. They called themselves Brownstoners, and they understood what they were doing as an act of rescue, saving beautiful buildings from a city that had given up on them. They were not wrong about the buildings, but the story of what their arrival meant for the people already living in those buildings and in those neighborhoods is considerably more complicated than the rescue narrative allows. To understand the brownstone revival, you have to understand what Brooklyn's brownstone neighborhoods actually looked like in 1960. Not the stained, noble ruins of the preservation imagination, but the living communities that existed inside and around those buildings. Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights, parts of Fort Greene and Clinton Hill, these were not simply zones of blight and abandonment. They were working-class and lower-middle-class communities, majority Black and significantly Caribbean and Latino, that had formed in the post-war decades as white middle-class families departed and African-American migrants from the South and immigrants from the Caribbean moved in. The brownstones in these neighborhoods were often crowded, often poorly maintained by absentee landlords, often cut into more units than their infrastructure could comfortably support. But they were also homes. They were the physical containers of communities that had built churches, businesses, social organizations, and decades of shared life in the spaces the previous tenants had vacated. When the first wave of Brownstoners arrived in the early 1960s, they were arriving into this living landscape. Their presence was not neutral. A young white professional buying a deteriorated brownstone in a Black neighborhood for a few $1,000s and restoring it to single-family use was performing several transactions simultaneously: a real estate investment, an aesthetic project, and a social displacement, whether or not any of these were consciously intended. The restored brownstone that became a beautiful single-family home had previously housed multiple families who now needed somewhere else to go. In a city with a severe shortage of affordable housing, somewhere else was not always easy to find. The Brownstoners of the 1960s and 1970s did not, for the most part, think of themselves as displacement agents. They thought of themselves as pioneers, a word they used without apparent awareness of what pioneering had historically meant for the people already present in the territory being pioneered. The Brownstone revival was, in many of its individual human moments, a story of real dedication and real beauty recovered. But the aggregate effect of that individual dedication was a shift in who could afford to live in Brooklyn's brownstone neighborhoods. A shift that accelerated decade by decade, driven by the rising property values that followed restoration and landmarking and the arrival of each successive wave of more affluent newcomers. The landmarking campaigns that accompanied the Brownstone revival added another layer to this dynamic. Brooklyn Heights received Historic District designation in 1965, the first historic district in Brooklyn. Park Slope followed in 1973. The designation spread through the brownstone neighborhoods over the following decades, legally protecting the buildings from demolition and significant alteration, ensuring that the physical fabric of the 19th century streetscape would survive. The landmarking was, architecturally, an unambiguous success. It preserved some of the finest collections of Victorian urban domestic architecture in the United States. But landmarking also had an economic effect that its advocates did not always acknowledge publicly. It raised property values, significantly and durably. A brownstone in a landmarked historic district was a more valuable asset than one without that protection, and the value increase compounded over time as the neighborhoods became increasingly desirable, increasingly expensive, and increasingly homogeneous in ways that were not purely architectural. By the 1980s and into the 1990s, the brownstone revival had produced a new phenomenon that required a new vocabulary. The word gentrification entered common American usage to describe what was happening in Brooklyn, and the brownstone was its central symbol and its primary mechanism. The brownstone neighborhoods of Brooklyn in 1985 were genuinely better maintained, genuinely less dangerous, genuinely more economically vital in certain measurable ways than they had been in 1965. The buildings that might have been demolished were standing, the streetscapes that had been deteriorating were stabilized. There was real urban recovery in the physical fabric of the place. But the people who had lived through the worst years, who had maintained community life in deteriorating buildings, who had raised children and built institutions and stayed when leaving would have been easier, were increasingly unable to afford to remain in the neighborhoods their endurance had helped stabilize. The recovery of the buildings and the displacement of the communities happened simultaneously, driven by the same forces inseparable from each other. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the cultural machinery around the Brownstone went into full production. Brownstone Brooklyn became a brand, appearing in films and television shows, in magazine profiles and real estate supplements, in the aspirational vocabularies of young professionals from around the country and eventually around the world. Sesame Street had been filming on a brownstone stoop since 1969, embedding the image in the childhood imagination of generations of American viewers. Prestige television dramas used brownstone interiors as shorthand for a particular kind of cultivated, liberal, successful New York life. Real estate listings described brownstone details, the original moldings, the marble mantelpieces, the wide plank floors, with a reverence previously reserved for sacred objects. The Brownstone had completed one of the more remarkable journeys in American architectural history. In less than a century, it had traveled from fashionable to unfashionable, from respectable to blighted, from nearly demolished to irreplaceable, and had arrived, finally, at luxury. By the 2000s and 2000s, a fully restored brownstone in Brooklyn Heights or Park Slope was a multi-million-dollar asset. The cheap stone that speculative builders had chosen in the 1840s because it was cheaper than marble was now commanding prices that made the original marble alternative seem modest. The mass-produced aristocracy had become actual aristocracy. The affordable palazzo had become unaffordable. The stoop rose just as high as ever. The door at the top was just as beautiful. It was simply harder now to reach it. On any given morning in Brooklyn, someone is photographing a stoop. They are standing on the sidewalk, framing the shot carefully, the brownstone facade filling the background, the iron railings catching the light, the carved doorway centered at the top of the steps. The light is good. The stone is warm and honey-colored in the morning sun. The photograph is taken, and within minutes it is somewhere on the internet, accumulating small affirmations from people who have never stood on that sidewalk but immediately recognize what they are looking at. This happens hundreds of times a day. The image has been reproducing itself for decades, accumulating meaning and nostalgia and aspiration until the photograph of the stoop has become one of the most legible visual symbols in American culture. It means New York. It means arrival. It means the earned reward of urban ambition. What it almost never shows is what that arrival cost, or who it displaced, or what the building looked like 30 years ago. The brownstone today is luxury real estate, preservation battleground, and unresolved history, all at once, all in the same stone. The communities that maintained life in these buildings during the hard decades that stayed when leaving would have been easier do not appear prominently in most revival narratives. The buildings have a preservation movement. The people who lived in them during the difficult years largely do not. Walk a brownstone block today, and you are walking through 150 years of the same argument about who belongs, who stays, and what gets protected and what gets sacrificed. The beauty is real. The stone endures. But the dream it sells, the dream of arrival, of belonging, of looking out from the parlor window and feeling you are on the right side of the glass. That dream is still for sale. The price has simply become, for most people, impossible. The stoop endures. The carved door waits at the top of the steps. But now perhaps we know to look for the door beneath it.